Welcome to Beyond at Home. And on this episode, we're talking about, well, home. But more specifically, we're talking about why is it that people don't feel at home when it comes to being a part of the local church? Well, by the end of this episode, we're going to talk about that. I'm going to give you one thing that you can do to ensure that people always feel at home at Beyond. Now, depending on your upbringing and your family background, the word home might mean a whole bunch of different things to you. For some of you, maybe home is actually a physical place, and you think of a house or a building or a street that you grew up in. For others of you, maybe you think of home, you don't think so much as a building, but you think of a group of people, maybe a circle of friends or a team. However we think about home, regardless of our experiences, there's two things that we usually associate when it comes to home. The first thing is that home is comfortable, right? You know your way around home. You feel comfortable you know where the kombucha is, you know where the food is, you can walk around the refrigerator, you know, and you feel comfortable at home. The second thing about home is that home is a judgment-free zone. You don't have to wear a mask, you can be yourself. You're not trying to be someone that you're not when it comes to home. And this applies to everyone, whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you're at uni, whether you're living with flatmates. Home is a place we all want to feel comfortable, and that can be a judgment-free zone for all of us. Here at Beyond, and particularly here at Beyond at Home, we want this to be a place where you can feel at home, where you can feel comfortable. And particularly if you're watching this Beyond at Home, chances are you're probably watching this in your pajamas, you're probably relaxing, you're probably very, very comfortable because you're in your home. But here's what else we want you to know, that this is a judgment-free zone. Now, if you're watching online, there are chances are that the reason that you're maybe watching this is because you actually don't feel those things in church. Perhaps you had a bad experience growing up, or maybe a bad experience at school, or someone you know, or you've just kind of got this impression that church is far from comfortable and it's definitely not a judgment-free zone. And so you're kind of checking this out online before you maybe even consider going to a physical location. And really, I think for the majority of our community, if I was to ask them, hey, what do you feel about church? Most of them would say that, well, God kind of seems distant. Faith, it sort of seems irrelevant. And church is just altogether foreign. And as a Jesus follower and as a pastor, this really saddens me. And if you're a Jesus follower, I really hope this saddens you. In fact, I hope this breaks your heart, because you know just how powerful it can be to live with Jesus in your life. You know just how powerful it can be when you begin to follow the ways of Jesus, when life takes a turn, that you have a circle of people in your corner who are cheering for you. And even if you're not a Jesus follower, surely at some level you recognize that those statements that God is distant, faith seems irrelevant, and church is foreign, at some level don't really make sense, right? Like, think about this. Like, if God is real and God exists, then it doesn't make sense for God to be distant. And if God is real, then faith should be far from irrelevant. Faith should be the most relevant thing on the planet. And if God is real and faith is relevant, then church, it shouldn't be foreign to anyone. It should definitely feel like home for people. The good thing is for us is that this is not a new challenge that people have wrestled with. This is not a new tension. In fact, Jesus followers have been wrestling with this tension for thousands of years. And we're going to look at how they fixed it right now. Now, the event that started the Jesus movement was the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Now, there were hundreds of people that witnessed these events, which means there were hundreds and then thousands of people that very, very quickly started following Jesus. Now, you would think this was a good thing, right? And it kind of was, but here's the thing we miss, is that Jesus was Jewish. And the Jewish system already had this way of kind of relating to God and connecting with God figured out, or so they thought. But when Jesus came into the world, he offered a new way, not just for the Jews, but for all people. And anyone who wasn't Jewish was called a Gentile. So if you're not Jewish, you're probably a little bit like me, you're a Gentile. And there were these whole bunch of Gentile people who saw Jesus and they heard the message of Jesus and they leaned in and they began to follow. But then they began to ask questions, well, if I want to follow Jesus, do I have to become a Jew? Like how does one become a Jew? Like, what's the process around that? And that's where this guy called Paul comes in. See, Paul was Jewish. Paul was the best lawkeeper of all the Jews. In fact, he often referred to himself as a Pharisee of Pharisees. And the Pharisees kept this sect. They were the lawkeepers of the Jewish religion. And so Paul was what he would call the best of the best, the best of the best rule keepers. And Paul was this way until he had an encounter with Jesus that transformed the way he understood the world. And so Paul would write letters after this encounter to churches all around the Mediterranean rim, a lot of which he started. And one of the things he writes most passionately about is that Jesus' death and resurrection mean that anyone, Jew or Gentile, can come to him. And this is what Paul writes in a letter to a church at Ephesus. He says this. He says, don't forget that you Gentiles used to be outsiders, right? Talking to the Gentiles. He said, you were called, get this, uncircumcised heathens by the Jews who are proud of their circumcision. Aren't you glad we don't use labels like that to define people? He goes on, he says, in those days you were living apart from Christ. Okay, so Jesus hadn't come into the world. The Jesus movement hadn't begun yet. And as a result, here's what he says, you were excluded from citizenship among the people of Israel, and you did not know the covenant promises God made to them. You lived in this world without God and without hope. And Paul is just at this point just painting this picture of how distant God would have felt for them and how irrelevant faith would have been and how foreign the church actually was. But then he goes on and he writes this. He says, but now you have been united or connected with Christ Jesus. Once you were far away from God, but now you have been brought near to him. And he says how he's been brought near to him, and it's through it sounds weird, but let me explain. He says, you have been brought near to him through the blood of Christ. Right now, that sounds super, super weird, but let me just explain. What Paul is saying here is that when Jesus hung on the cross, as he bled out, as a spear pierced his side, and as he breathed his last breath, as he was laid in that empty tomb, and then 3 days later, as he overcame death, Paul is saying that God, through that, drew near to you. That through that event, God showed that he is for you. God showed that he wants to have a relationship with you, and there's not anything you can do to earn that. It's a gift that's freely given. And then he goes on, he says, for Christ himself has brought peace to us. He united Jew and Gentile into one. So there's no longer two groups, one people. When in his own body on the cross, he broke down the wall of hostility that separated us. Paul's saying there used to be things that would be barriers from Gentiles coming to God in the same way there would be things that would be barriers from Jews to coming to God. Well, now Jesus has broken those barriers down. And he did this by ending the system of law with its commandments and regulations. He made peace between Jews and Gentiles by creating in himself one new people from the two groups. And if you want to hear a little bit more about this, then go back and listen to part 3 of Be Rich. It's called Love versus Everything. It was on the last episode of Beyond at Home. But together as one body, he says Christ reconciled both groups to God by means of his death on the cross, and our hostility towards each other was put to death. And Paul needed both groups to understand that Jesus was near to him. So he writes this next. He said, he brought this good news of peace to you Gentiles who were far away from him, and peace to the Jews who were near. Now, all of us, that's important to know, all of us, every single person can come to the Father through the Holy Spirit because of what Christ has done for us. And if that wasn't clear enough, Paul brings it all together and he clears up any possible misunderstanding up until this point. He says, so now you Gentiles are no longer strangers and foreigners. You are citizens along with all of God's holy people. You are members of that family. See, when Jesus died on the cross, he took away what was foreign and made it familiar. And he invited you and me to be a part of it. And as you might guess, the tension that Paul was writing about, the tension that Paul was wrestling with, didn't just go away in the first century. In fact, 2,000 years later, we are still wrestling with that very tension. Now, this tension is a big reason why Beyond exists in the first place, because we want people to see that God is close, that faith is relevant, and that church feels like home. We want everyone who watches online like you, or maybe attends a physical service or attends a group or is involved in our Infinity Youth or our Upstreet children's environments. We want people to know that God is close, that God is for you, that before you were for God, that God was for you, that God gave his life for you. We want people to see that faith is relevant, that following Jesus, it will actually make your life better and it will make you better at life. And we want people to feel and embrace that church feels like home, that it feels like having people in your corner so that when you inevitably face what life has to throw at you, that you're not doing it alone. And really the reason that we do this, the reason why we want people to feel at home at Beyond is so that people will feel at home with God. And here's the easiest way I found personally in my own life to ensure that someone feels at home at church so that ultimately they feel at home with God. And it's the Form Monday for this week. And if you're brand new, the Form Monday is simply the easiest way to engage with everything that we've been talking about in this episode. And the Form Monday for this week is to invest and invite. Invest in the lives of people who don't yet know Jesus, and then invite them to engage. Share this content with them. Maybe invite them to our Infinity Youth environments, to a physical service, or to one of our children's environments like Upstreet. And you might be thinking to yourself when you hear this, Chris, isn't this just some gimmick again to get to invite people to church? Well, it's not, because this is the best way to begin to identify some of the things that might stand in the way of someone feeling at home. Because here's the thing, when you invite someone, you hope that there's someone at the door to greet them. When you invite someone, you hope the environment is appealing. When someone is sitting next to you who you've invited for the first time, you hope that the music is awesome, the lighting looks great, and the communicator doesn't say anything offensive. Really what you're hoping for is that the leaders and the volunteers and beyond would care as much about your friend as you do. And here's the thing, when you begin to invest and invite people along or share this content with them, you begin to evaluate it in a different way. You begin to think about it in a different way. And you begin to think, will my friends feel at home? Will my family feel at home? And when you do that, and you begin to think that way, you begin to think about the way in which people can feel at home with God. So this week, invest in the lives of people that you care about and invite them. Christmas is the best time to do it. And in doing so, our hope is that we will create an environment where people will feel at home, not ultimately with the church, but at home with God.